1,600 years ago, Britain left the Roman Empire, and the island swiftly fell into ruin. Grand cities and luxurious villas were deserted and left to crumble, and civil society collapsed into chaos. Into this violent and unstable world came foreign invaders from across the sea and established themselves as its new masters. Tracing this history is today's guest, Marc Morris, author of The Anglo-Saxons, a history of the beginnings of England from 400 to 1066. We discuss the turbulent history of these people across the next 6 centuries, and get into how their earliest rulers fought relentlessly against each other for glory and supremacy, and then were almost destroyed by the onslaught of the Vikings. We explore how they abandoned their old gods for Christianity, established hundreds of churches, and created dazzlingly intricate works of art. There was the revival of towns and trade, and the beginnings of a familiar landscape of shires, boroughs, and bishoprics. Famous figures enter the scene, like King Offa, Alfred the Great, and Edward the Confessor, but also a number of lesser-known characters, ambitious queens, revolutionary saints, intolerant monks, and grasping nobles. And it's this dark ages of England when figures like King Arthur emerge, and we'll discuss whether or not he was actually real. Most people believe he wasn't, but he may have been connected to Arthur-like figures, as historians of this period describe them. We'll see how much truth is actually in these legends. So we're going to get into a period of history that is only dimly understood and try to separate truth from legend and see how the foundations of England were laid. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Marc Morris. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Scott.
I'm looking forward to your book topic because we're delving into a realm of history that most people avoid. We'll look at the Dark Ages, although I reject the notion of the entire medieval age called this term, and I accept how specialists have called it as the period where we simply have scant historical evidence of what actually went on in this period. And then we'll go from here to the consolidation of England, and I'm really looking forward to this. So to kick things off, could you describe to me, first of all, what was Roman Britain like at its height? Was it as secure and prosperous as the heartland of Rome, or it was always more of a peripheral borderland? And talk me through the first Brexit, the Roman Brexit, and how cataclysmic it was to British civilization.
Well, I have to say, I'm not a historian of the Roman world per se, so I've written a book on the formation of England that comes after that. So I can't make very expert comparisons between Roman Britain and, the rest of the Roman Empire. What I can say is that compared to what follows, Roman Britain is extremely sophisticated. So people will have all these pre-existing shorthand things for the Roman civilization, like villas and mosaic floors and underfloor heating and running water, all these things that you associate with sophistication and civilization. And so all that's there in Roman Britain, although these kind of, these sound trite. Roman roads as well, for example, Roman roads famously straight connecting cities. So Britannia, from the 1st century onwards until the 4th century, has all these hallmarks of Roman, for want of a better word, civilization. So it has towns and cities and canals and roads and international trade and sophisticated architecture. Sophisticated architecture, I meant to say sophisticated agriculture, but both of those things. So it's part of a very, very highly sophisticated international empire. Now, I say all of that, and I'm conscious of the fact that some people might be saying, he's here to praise Rome, because that was the attitude in the 19th century, of course. Historians and politicians and people of all stamps were looking back in search of validation of their own 19th century empire, so very much in praise of Rome. Nowadays, historians are conscious that all that sophistication and all that wealth that's being extracted comes at a heavy price for the people at the bottom of the pile. So the people who are almost invisible in Roman Britain are the people who are enslaved and working in the fields, incredibly long, hours and arduous jobs in order to support all that wealth extraction. So, but nevertheless, the key point is very sophisticated and lots of economic specialization. So you have mosaic makers and sword makers and shield makers and butchers and, just every single sort of walk of life. That economic and political system starts to go into rapid decline in the late 4th century and into the early 5th century. And as the heartlands of the Roman Empire start to run into difficulty, they start to withdraw resources from the furthest flung parts, like Britannia in the far northwest. And people sort of think about the legions leaving Rome around about 409, 410. Actually, what the meager sources we have suggest is that the Britons, the people living in Britain, whether they were a mix of Roman immigrants or native Britons, the Romano Britons, got so fed up with the state of affairs where they were still expected to pay taxes, and yet they were not being defended, they weren't being supported by an army, that they rejected Roman rule and decided they were going to go it alone. So that's what one of our best informed sources says. They threw out the Roman magistrates and declared that they're going to defend themselves in future and live independently. So as you say, it is the sort of, it has a Brexity flavour to it. But what seems to be the case after that is Britain then goes into a very, very rapid period of social and economic decline. One historian, much more sort of skilled in this area than I am, has described it as perhaps, or probably, the most rapid and severe period of economic and social decline in British history, full stop. So, once the army is gone, then you get a rise in looting and robbery and brigandage. And once, basically a failed state, so sort of to cut to the chase. So the towns are abandoned, the villas are abandoned because they can't be defended. That means hundreds of thousands of people homeless and on the move, and vulnerable to outside attackers, who've been attacking for generations, the Picts, the Scots, the Atticots, and coming across the sea from Northern Europe, the Saxons. And all of a sudden, because there are no longer any well-garrisoned fortresses or armies to repel these invaders, they have more or less open season raiding on Britain, sort of seizing slaves and booty. So a not great time to be alive, I think, the early part of the 5th century in Britain.
And this period is challenging. I had a guest a few years ago who talked about the historicity of King Arthur, and she mentioned that the sources we have are church chronicles and other things written centuries after the fact. And a challenge any historian has, as you well know, when you're relying on these sources, is you're usually talking more about their own time period more than the period that they're trying to report on, or, using selective editing to sneakily praise their patron, which you always have to do when you're patronized to write a work. But this Dark Age period, Dark Age again, because we simply know very little about it, out of this cauldron, what begins to emerge as a new culture when there are different groups coming in from the outside to extract wealth from this former civilization? But from what you can tell, what begins to be built up in its place that we can say is distinct from the rest of continental European civilization?
Yeah, well, lots to unpack there. I'll try and do that slowly because there's lots of things to say there. And as you said, the evidence is so weak. So what we see, or rather, let's start with the written sources that you mentioned, incredibly meager. We basically have one. We've got one native source. We've got a guy called Gildas, who's a monk writing in either the late 5th or more likely the early 6th century. And he writes a tract called The Ruin of Britain. And it has a historical introduction, but his main purpose is to castigate the British rulers of his own day for their moral failings. But he does give us a bit of history to begin with, and a lot of it is demonstrably wrong. And as he says himself, because I haven't got any libraries anymore, I haven't got any books, I've had to kind of, rely on books that are inadequate, or I've had to rely on folk memory. So we've got Gildas. And much later on, riffing off of Gildas, in the early 8th century, we've got perhaps the most famous of all Anglo-Saxon historians, the Venerable Bede. But he's writing in early 8th century Northumbria, so he's nearly 3 centuries after the events he's describing. Both of those writers describe the arrival of the Saxons in the middle of the 5th century. So you've got people emigrating from, as they understood it, Saxony, North Germany. As we know now from their archaeological legacy, people coming from all over the north coast of Europe and the southern coast of Scandinavia. So not just Saxons, but Angles, Jutes, Swedes, Frisians, Franks, etc. All settling in the eastern part of Britain, so what is now eastern England. The story told by Gildas and Bede is they were originally invited in as mercenaries. So the Saxons were employed in the first instance as mercenaries to fight against Britain's other enemies, the Picts and the Scots. And then after a short period, we don't know how long, they revolted against their British employers and simply took the land for themselves. All of which, although legendary and traditional, seems at core quite credible, because we know that other Roman polities, other Roman rulers in other parts of the empire regularly employed barbarians, routinely employed barbarians as mercenary troops. So the question is, after the Saxon revolt, what's going on? And we are almost totally at a loss apart from Gildas. The question really turns on, as to what changed, how many people came over, and that's an unknowable question. Historians once tended to think that Germanic peoples came over in vast numbers, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and more or less totally supplanted, either by driving out or killing, the Romano-British population. Nowadays, certainly in the last 50 years or so, 60 years or so, that explanation has fallen way out of fashion, and it's reckoned that the immigration was much smaller. Having said that, I veer away from the extreme position that it was, virtually invisible, that it was only a kind of a trace element. The immigration seems to me, and I think quite a lot of other historians, as sizable. So hundreds of thousands of people coming over in the course of a century, but at the same time, not nearly as many people coming in as there were still native Romano-British. So the question, the real puzzle is, that being the case, why do you end up with a population that ultimately, and I think quite quickly, ends up worshipping Germanic gods, people like Tyr and Woden and Thor and Free, who give us the days of the week in English, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? And why do you end up with people that speaks a Germanic language, Old English, rather than Britannic? And the answer seems to me, the obvious answer seems to me, is because these are the people in power. These are the people who are waving the swords and telling people what to do. Because in a failed state, in a kind of post-apocalyptic society, if you like, if you were a person like me who was a specialist who wrote books, or if I was Marcus the mosaic layer, and my skills, my whole life, I was from a long line of men who laid mosaics but didn't know how to fight, you're going to come off badly against an immigrant population who are in many ways much more primitive. But they are like survivalists. They raise their own pigs and their own animals. They make their own clothes. They build their own houses of wood. They fight their own battles. They sharpen their own swords. They are self-sufficient, and therefore they are better at coping in this brave new world than the population of late Roman Britain. And so they're the people in charge. And if you want to get on in this world, then you best learn to speak their language, and you better start worshipping their gods. So that's the situation as I see it. What's interesting is, in that first, say, century and a half, we don't actually see much in the way of social differentiation, whichever communities we look at. Bede tells us that when these people arrived in the middle of the 5th century, there were kings from the start. He mentions a legendary pair of brothers called Hengist and Horsa, who were the forefathers of the kings of Kent. But when we look at the early archaeological record, we don't see much in the way of social differentiation. It's not until the late 6th century that we suddenly see this burst in the archaeology of phenomena that say these are elites, new elites competing for power. The most significant things are great halls, so huge wooden halls built by men who are trying to big themselves up and entertain their entourages on a great scale. So the kind of halls that you associate with Theoden in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or Beowulf, if you've read Beowulf, Hrothgar's hall in Beowulf. And the other thing is your princely burials. The kind of thing made famous by the Sutton Hoo ship burial, so you have a great lord or a great lady, but more commonly a great lord, the ones we find, buried with all his finery, so sort of gold, silver, weapons, jewels, etc., and then buried under a great tumulus, a great mound of earth. So all of a sudden, it seems in the late 6th century, 100 or 150 years after their original arrival, we have the emergence of kingdoms.
I'd like to ask something just to follow up on what you said about with the coming of Germanic people and their religion, their cosmology, their gods, which give us our days of the week. This new religion comes in, and I'm curious about the process of the re-Christianization of England. There's a book I read many years ago by Philip Jenkins called The Lost History of Christianity, and his point is that for the first millennium of Christianity, the center of gravity of the religion was really in the East. There were far more Nestorian Christians in Persia or Central Asia, whereas Europe was essentially a backwater at this time. And with places like England after the fall of Britain, those with the first arrival of Christianity, that was very associated with the Roman Empire. With the collapse of Roman civilization, there also came a persecution against Christians there. And it goes to assume that at this point, with the arrival of these immigrants from Scandinavia, from Saxony, they're bringing in their Norse pantheon as well. So within this, and I think there's reference to persecution against Christians that goes on in the 6th century and 7th century. How does the reemergence of Christianity happen? Is it similar to the arrival of Christianity with Ireland, with monks coming from continental Europe, or what does that process look like?
Well, put simply, so as you say, there was Rome itself, and Roman Britain as part of the Roman Empire was Christian from the beginning of the 4th century, or officially Christian. The difficulty is knowing how much Christianity there was in Britannia before its fall in the early 5th century, because we don't have the written record. So you're reliant on things like archaeology. You can excavate a Roman villa and say, oh, look, there's a Christian symbol here. There's a mosaic of Christ. So clearly this villa owner was a Christian. But is it just an elite religion? How widely is it practiced down the social chain? We just don't know. We can guess, but we can't say for certain. Christianity seems to kind of be quickly disappears quickly into the 5th and 6th centuries. And then, as you say, it is brought back towards the very end of the 6th century, in the first instance by a Roman mission. So it's Pope Gregory the Great who sends St. Augustine, who arrives in southeastern England, or what would be England. He arrives in the Kingdom of Kent in 597, and he quickly converts the King of Kent and then the Kentish people. So Christianity, the conversion of the southeastern kings starts in late 6th century. On into the 7th century, you have another missionary endeavor, which comes from a place you've just mentioned, Ireland, because this is where it gets complicated. So you remember I said, so the Britons in late Roman Britain was Christian. And in that struggle between the Anglo-Saxons who are arriving in the 5th century, the Britons are being driven further and further to the west. So those who do not sort of submit to the Anglo-Saxons and reinvent themselves as Anglo-Saxons, if they're preserving their British culture, they're ending up in places like Wales or Cornwall or Cumbria or Strathclyde, places in the west of the island. As Gildas says, the more hilly and mountainous parts. They're being driven to the extremities. In those areas, Christianity survives, and they have a new form of, I suppose, religious existence that comes in the 5th and 6th centuries, which is monasticism. So monasticism starts in 3rd century Egypt and sort of slowly spreads its way across Europe, and it's being taken round from the west coast of Francia and Brittany into Western Britain, Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries. Now, it's those Christians, those monastic communities, that introduced Christianity into northern England at the start of the 7th century. So we have, and the base for all of that is that the starting point is an island off the coast of Northumbria called Lindisfarne, the cradle of Christianity in northern England, founded by St. Aidan in, I'm going to get the date right, 635 AD. So you've got those two missionary endeavors, and skip to the end. they succeed in Christianizing all those Anglo-Saxon kingdoms by the end of the 7th century. So it's quite a swift process, but it is also, I think, and this is one of the ways my emphasis differs somewhat to traditional histories, it's also quite a coercive and violent process. You know, Christians, particularly in the modern era, tend to like to sort of imagine it was all kind of handshakes and pats on the head and everyone kind of saw the light and that was it. But that's true of the kings, because you woo the kings, you woo the great and powerful, and then the kings with the swords and the armed retinues compel everybody else to say, you're old gods, forget about them, you're now worshipping this guy. So that's what's going on in the 7th century.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Well, as a quick aside, we'll get into the sort of the reconstruction of this new civilization with the towns and trade and shires and really the heart of your book. But one question, I mean, you've referenced a lot that there's the traditional narrative of English history that is very similar to how a lot of histories were written, whether French history or Ottoman history, which is my specialty. And up until the 19th century, people really took chroniclers at their word. And histories of this time would basically repeat different chroniclers and assemble different ones and put them together, translate out of whatever language they were originally written in, and then present this history to the public. And then with 20th century, you have the rise of critical history, really looking at why a source was saying what it was saying to unpack that. And then there's new sciences have come in with archaeology, with genetic testing to see large swaths of population movement to give us new information. But for you, I mean, as a historian pushing back against traditional narratives, how are historians like yourself trying to look at the time period in which you're writing in a new way? So believe it or not, my audience is interested in historiography. You can believe such a thing. So I love seeing how the sausage gets made.
I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm not a great sort of theorist when it comes to historical. I kind of do what I do, you know, I sit down and write my books. But you're right. If you look at 19th century history books, there is a sort of scissors and paste approach to chroniclers. This one says this and this one says that. And they are not assessed with quite the same or anything like the same level of scrutiny that they would be in the modern age. So as you say, whenever you have a source, you say, well, who wrote it? What is their agenda? Why are they trying to convey this particular information? What are they not saying? What do we know from other sources? What does the archaeology suggest? So I give you one example. We just talked about the 7th century and the conversion. And I decided to frame my account of the conversion around the story of a brilliant story of a very controversial figure called St. Wilfred, who ended up being Bishop of Northumbria. But whereas most other saints' lives, the saints, you know, they perform quite sort of twee miracles, like they healed a sick plant or they spoke to an otter or something, you know, and you think, well, that doesn't sound, I can't make a story out of that. Whereas Wilfred's life is, he starts off on Lindisfarne, the island off the coast of Northumbria, and he gets fed up with that. And as a teenager, he goes to Rome and he sees the wonders of Rome in his mind. He comes back and he's an advocate for Roman Christianity. And then he falls out with all the monks of Lindisfarne. Then he falls out with the king of Northumbria and he goes into exile and he fights against pagans. And then he goes back to Rome and then he goes, you know, so he just has this most incredibly long 7-decade life, full of incident and controversy and political intrigue. And he's clearly a power in the land in his own right. He's like a prince bishop, a warrior bishop with a great retinue of soldiers. He's able, for example, to underwrite a coup in France. He puts a new king of France on the West Frankish throne. So he's a really extraordinary political and ecclesiastical player. And yet, this biography, wonderful it is, grist to the mill of a narrative historian, you have to read it against the grain because it is setting out, any source like that that's written posthumously is normally written because people were saying, wasn't he awful? You know, and the source is written by an acolyte, a devotee, trying to justify his reputation. And there's just one bit that sort of made me laugh out loud when I was reading it, which is that apropos of nothing, it starts to say, Wilfred never had too much to drink at dinner, and he only ever drank half a glass of wine at any meal. And anyone who says otherwise is not telling the truth, because he was moderate in all things. And you think, as a reader, you think, how very interesting, because I didn't even ask about his alcohol consumption. And yet this is being volunteered out of the blue. And you think,
is he an alcoholic or what's going on there?
What it suggests is that there were plenty of other voices at the time saying, Wilfred, well, we know Wilfred was big on the party, right? Whether it was wine or women or whatever. But there's a sense of damage and reputational control. And you see that with every source I've dealt with. They're great fun to interrogate. So History of William Marshall tells us what a great guy William Marshall was. He was so loyal, he was so faithful, he always stuck with his lord, he always told the truth. And yet he served 5 consecutive Angevin kings, which suggests a canny knack for political survival. And that is commissioned by his sons after his death. Now, my sons gave me a mug, that says world's greatest dad on it. But that doesn't have to be the absolute truth. But it's just this sense that you have to know why these sources are being commissioned and with what agenda. And then you can read them against the grain, and then it becomes fun.
Yeah, now I can't stop thinking, okay, he was probably an alcoholic, or it's just if someone is shoving something in your face without you ever mentioning it, thinking, okay, where did that come from? And you start interrogating it. It's almost like Kremlinology, of reading Soviet Pravda newspapers and looking in between the lines of what's actually going on.
There's just one more example. There's a really good source for William the Conqueror, a contemporary biography by his chaplain called the Gesta Guilhelmi, the Deeds of William. The best source bar none for the Conqueror's career. And it's that double-edged sword. He's William the Conqueror's chaplain. He probably heard William the Conqueror confess his sins, so he's right up close to this most important character in 11th century English history. And so when he says something like, after Christmas, the Conqueror went to Barking and there was a great council and he held all the men there, you've no reason to doubt that, because it's prosaic. And, why would you lie about the location or the timing? Or, you can think of reasons, but most likely true. But when he launches into some great defense of William's clemency and how no Englishman was ever unjustly deprived of his land, or the restraint of Norman soldiers when it came to English women after the conquest, no soldier ever forced himself on an English woman. Or so you kind of think, perhaps the reality was rather different. And you are, as you say, this is you as a propagandist. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like he's one of those, sometimes these chroniclers, or even these hagiographers, if they're writing about saints, you can bet your bottom dollar that almost the opposite of what they are saying was the case, or at least some people thought it was, because they thought that was worth refuting.
Yeah, there's a lot more to unpack with like historiographical tricks, which you've revealed a great deal there. Now, getting into, the heart of your book, it's hard where to go from here because there's so many different avenues. Now, as we get into the 7th, 8th century, and traditional chronology would mention figures like Alfred the Great, Edward the Confessor, which you do get into in the book. There's so many other institutions that come into play, bishoprics, the power of the church, trade networks are being built up. As England becomes wealthier, it also becomes a target of Viking raids because, of course, if you have a wealthy settlement or a monastery on the coast, what Viking worth his salt wouldn't want to go on a pillaging raid across the sea? So these institutions, could you describe their rise and how are they contesting against one another? Just because I don't want to place one in supremacy against the other, because it is sort of an organic growth. So could you describe that process?
We can get onto that, but I think, if I may, a good question that would be, because you said a lot of interesting stuff there, I think a good question to address for people who aren't familiar with this period is, how do we get from this galaxy of competing kingdoms? I've already mentioned Kent and Northumbria, but it seems that with kingdoms, you start off with dozens and dozens. So kingdoms grow up organically from small communities, and the bigger ones start to bully the smaller ones into submission. So by the time you get to the 7th century, you've got 7 big players. Well, in fact, you've got 7 kingdoms, a couple of which are also around. You've got Essex and Sussex, the East Saxons and the South Saxons, who are they're already on the way out. But you've got big players in the West Saxons or Wessex, the great Midland kingdom of Mercia, the very rich, though small kingdom in the southeast, which is Kent, East Anglia in the east, and Northumbria, this huge power north of the River Humber in the far north. The question is, how do you get from this plurality of kingdoms down to one which is eventually called Anglo-land, the land of the Angles? And the answer you've given is basically the Vikings, because they're all sort of bustling along, competing with each other. The Vikings start off in the late 8th century as a pest. as a nuisance. So because they're, as you say, raiding vulnerable communities like Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne, that seat of Christianity, that cradle of Christianity in northern England, is attacked famously by the Vikings in 793. And like a modern terrorist atrocity, it sends shockwaves throughout Western Europe. How could this happen? What happens thereafter is Viking raids increase in intensity. And by the middle of the 9th century, these guys who had been raiders, opportunistically attacking undefended monks, are invading far inland and sacking cities and putting towns to the torch and capturing and ransoming bishops and defeating royal armies. And then in 865, you get this huge kind of conglomerate army appears, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army. And then the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms themselves start to fall. So East Anglia falls to the Vikings in 869. Northumbria had been conquered a couple of years earlier, and I think its last kings are about 873. Mercia, the big Midland kingdom that dominated the whole of Southumbria in the 8th century, that falls in 874. And then Wessex falls in 878. So it looks like all of them are gone, but Wessex famously fights back, and the heroic king there of legend is Alfred the Great, who quickly comes back in the same year, regains his kingdom, and starts to drive the Danes out of Western Mercia as well. So that's, I know, a fairly long answer to the question, but what you see thereafter is the kings of Wessex, who after Alfred adopt a new style. They, rather than calling themselves King of the West Saxons, Alfred and his immediate successors call themselves kings of the Anglo-Saxons. They're reaching out to the other polities, the Anglian polities that aren't Wessex, and saying, we have this shared culture. We are not heathens. We're not the heathen men, the Danes that have been attacking us. We are Angles, we are Saxons. We speak the same language. So Alfred has this, not only this military fight back, but this cultural pushback of translating Latin works into English, of sponsoring education, schools and whatnot. So that is really, it's from Alfred onwards that you get the foundations, the first foundations being made of a larger English state that emerges in the reigns of his successors in the 10th century.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about this. You had mentioned Alfred the Great, and a few years ago, I did a series on called The Most Powerful Women in the Middle Ages. One of them was Alfred's daughter, Athelflaed, which some think Eowyn in The Lord of the Rings is based on this figure. Lady of the Mercians, I don't believe she ruled as queen, but her, I think, power transferred to her daughter, and it was one of the only back-to-back female successions until something like the 16th century in England. But could you describe her? I mean, what were it? We could say, I think it's remarkable as a female ruler at this time period, since there are not that many other examples. So perhaps that says something about the political structure of the time. But what was her role in this time and her combat with Vikings and all that? Can you talk about her?
Well, I'll tell you what I know and what I think we don't know. To give you a little bit more background, I mean, you've got everything there right. She was the daughter of Alfred the Great, and she was married in around about 886, 887 to the man who ruled Western Mercia, who was a chap called Athelred. So we've got, or Ethelred, if you want to sort of modernize it, like Ethelred the Unready. Anyway, he might, in different circumstances, have been king of Mercia. We don't know what his background was. What happens, as I say, around about the start of the 880s is Alfred decides he is going to rule Western Mercia. It's going to be part of his kingdom. So he annexes that part of Mercia, while the Vikings take the other half. But he rules it with a light touch. So he lets this man, Athelred, rule it on his behalf. But Athelred is not permitted to style himself as king. But the great sort of the bone he's thrown, if you like, or the great sop to him is he is accorded the honor of marrying Alfred's daughter. So he's kind of brought into the family in that way. So it's a merger, a union. There's a reasonable assumption that he was older than, I don't know whether it's Athelflaed or Athelflad. I'm going to say Athelflad. There is a reasonable assumption that she was younger than him. And he is in any case reported as being ill in the early part of the 10th century. And then he dies, I think, in 910 or 911. And she rules for another 8 or 9 years after his death in her own right. So that's the remarkable thing. As you say, she's not called queen. She's styled Lady of the Mercians. There are, I think, there's an Irish source written later that calls her Queen of the Saxons. So clearly, you know, what title she was allowed to have or how she styled herself is she was the person running the show in Western Mercia. The hugely frustrating thing is, although we can sense she's very powerful, just as we can sense other 9th and 10th and 11th century women are very powerful, we know virtually nothing about her because the source material is so weak. So whereas we have, 100 pages on the life and times of Bishop Wilfred or King Alfred himself, what we've got for Athelflaed is about 9 or 10 lines of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Mercian Register. So it says things like, this year the Lady of the Mercians, Athelflaed, came to Derby and took it, and there was much slaughter, that sort of thing. It's literally these telegraphic lines of chronicle from which we can piece together the events of the last decade of her life. So we are pathetically, lamentably ill-informed about these powerful women. Whether she led armies in person or not is impossible to say. She's certainly described as, it's kind of described as she came to this place. Now, whether she is kind of like a Roman emperor kind of leading from the back, or whether she's like Zaina warrior princess leading from the front, we cannot determine. So you can draw your own Athelflaed, the one that exists in your head. But I think that's the key thing is it is the most frustrating thing as a historian of this period, that all your voluminous, and I'm using voluminous in relative terms, all your thick sources are concerned with men. And even on occasions where you can see that women are basically running the show. So in the middle of the 10th century, for example, the generation after Athelflaed, the kings of England come and go in quick succession. The two of them die in their teens and another couple die in their 30s. So they're young men, while their mothers remain at court from one generation to the next. And when you look at the administrative record, dry as it is, so charters issued by these kings, diplomas issued by these kings, and you look at the witnesses, there's always the queen there, or the queen mother, first in the line of witnesses. So you can sense they are the eminence grise throughout the whole period. And yet, they're just names on a page. They're ghosts. You cannot recover their personalities or even the outline of their careers. So if you're coming at this, if you're coming at this period expecting it to be, stuffed with, exciting stories of women, that's the most frustrating thing. There are some in Bede's account. There are some in the 11th century, but it's very hard to do women's political history in this period.
Right, and it's some people who take liberties too far, or that's maybe are projecting themselves. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, before getting into 1066, at this time period when you talked about Alfred the Great consolidating his conquest, and we see something of a unified Anglo-Saxon culture emerging, I don't want to leave this period quite yet. And also, it's always very challenging, even for professional historians, to not fall victim to presentism and to see different characters as part of this accelerating stream going to this point in history, because different figures are always imagining different futures, and simply because one or this other future didn't play out the way they imagined doesn't mean it's not worth trying to look at it on their terms. And you have lots of other figures in your book, and you mentioned revolutionary saints, intolerant monks, ambitious queens, grasping nobles. Are there any other figures that you would like to highlight out of your book that you think really give color to this era and exemplify its qualities?
Yeah, the one character in particular, so I've already mentioned Bishop Wilfred, who I felt sort of bestrode the 7th century like a colossus. And the other chapter that I think I had the most fun writing, because I knew the least about him to begin with, is a chapter on Bishop Dunstan, Archbishop Dunstan, or Saint Dunstan, as he later becomes. Now, some of your listeners may share the same prejudices that I carry over from my younger days as a teenager or when I was doing history in my 20s, that they kind of go, oh, ecclesiastical history, bishops, monks, it never sort of set my world on fire. I was always more interested in the secular politics. But the Dunstan story is just such a great one. And like Wilfred, he has a posthumous life written, which, although it touches on matters ecclesiastical, a lot of it is to do with secular politics and his relations with secular rulers. So that was a great way of exploring the politics of the middle of the 10th century, which is probably the crucial period when England is being formed. And although we know this was the great conjuring trick, I realized, as I've said, we know virtually nothing about the mid-10th century kings. So after Athelstan, about whom we know a little bit, we have this succession of kings, Edmund, Eadred, Edwy, Edgar, about whom we know virtually nothing. Or put it this way, we have administrative sources like charters, but we don't have narrative sources. So their careers are very difficult to reconstruct, impossible to reconstruct. Whereas Dunstan and two of his fellow reformers have richly documented careers. And what was fascinating to me about this is these were men who, after the tumult, after the chaos of the Viking period, when the church had been brought very low and monasteries everywhere had been destroyed, completely eradicated in many cases, these were the men who tried to reform monasticism, did reform monasticism, and refounded lots of these ruined houses. And the monasticism they embraced was different to that had gone before, in that it was much more puritanical and it was much more concerned with uniformity in every sense. So monks and nuns had to obey exactly the same rule wherever they were. Latin text had to be translated into English with exactly the same vocabulary, lest any error should creep in. Even the handwriting had to be regulated. So they were zealots, for want of a better word. And it's in exactly the same period that these men are obtaining the highest ecclesiastical offices. So Dunstan becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, Oswald becomes ultimately Archbishop of York, Athelwold becomes Bishop of Winchester, the richest see, or one of the richest sees in the whole of England. These are really powerful men, old men at the court of young kings, with the ears of powerful queens. I mean, not their ears, they have the ears of powerful queens. And it's in this period that you see uniformity emerging in the state as well. So you mentioned shires. Shires are suddenly appearing in the Midlands with shire courts, and they're broken down into hundreds, and hundreds have 100 courts. And you have a guy in charge of the shire on behalf of the king who's called the shire reeve, from which we get sheriffs. So all of these things, some of which are imported to the States, in the 19th century, all of these terms and all of these institutions are being formed in this period where you have zealots in charge who their watchword is everything must be the same. We must have one coin and it must have one picture of the king and it must be to the same weight and everything has to be standardized. And it's from this kind of almost theocratic environment that England is formed in the middle and later decades of the 10th century. So that period was fascinating to me. And I found that the way I could handle that as a historian who likes to tell a story rather than say, now let's talk about administrative history for 100 pages. The key to unlocking that incredible process was the life of Dunstan. So I found that, there are other lives in the story which would be unfamiliar to lay readers, but which I had done a lot of times in my career. So Alfred the Great, Ethelred the Unready, Edward the Confessor, they're all in the book doing what they normally do. But the stuff that was a journey of discovery for me was Wilfred and Dunstan.
So to come to 1066, which even those who don't know about English history have heard that date with the Norman Conquest. I'm not going to ask you to rehash that whole history. If listeners want to, I have a whole episode on that. You can just Google 1066 plus the podcast. But the Normans, a French group descended by Vikings, come to England and conquer it, and that permanently alters the culture of England, leading it on the long trajectory of what it becomes today. So what would you say in terms of the Anglo-Saxon culture that existed on England at this time, with the Norman Conquest, how would you describe what was lost with it?
What was lost as a result of the conquest? Okay, well, the biggest change that you get as a result of the conquest is the aristocracy is more or less totally wiped out. So the ruling class of England, its royal family, this is in the final instance, the Godwinsons, Harold Godwinson and his brothers, they all die or flee into exile. The other aristocrats, there are rebellions in the first few years after the conquest, and they end up being expelled or killed. And another thing your listeners may have heard of, even if they come to this fresh, besides the date 1066, is Domesday Book, which was compiled by the conqueror 20 years after 1066. And for his own fiscal purposes and purposes of control. But it's a wonderful resource for historians, because every question it asks about the value of land is asked twice. It's like, what was it like now? What's it like now? What's it worth now? And what was it like and what was it worth then in 1066? So it's like a kind of an old-fashioned speed camera. It takes two snapshots, and like a speed camera, the historian can work out what has changed in that precisely known period. And what you see happening, what you see is in 1066, obviously before the conquest, the aristocracy of England is Old English. And what you see 20 years after the event is the aristocracy, in case of the top people, the top 500 or so, almost all of them are continental newcomers. If you take it down to the second tier, the people who are the tenants of the king's own tenants, about 7,000 or 8,000 people, 90% of them are also newcomers. So the ruling class of England, the top 10,000 people, 9 times out of 10, they're newcomers. And as you say, ancestrally, some of them are Vikings, but culturally, they're French. They speak French. So what changes as a result of the conquest is you get lots of French words in the language. You get a newfangled form of fortification, which the Normans call the castle, which are introduced to England very rapidly, hundreds and hundreds of them being built in the first generation after the conquest. And you can see that in the laments of the source material. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is one of the sources that says castles everywhere. They were building castles and oppressing poor men. There's an architectural revolution, not just in new stone castles, but in churches. So all the Old English or Anglo-Saxon churches that were in existence, all the major ones are ripped down and replaced within a generation or two. So every cathedral, all 15 cathedrals are rebuilt within 2 generations of the conquest in a new Romanesque style. Same of all the major abbeys. And the last thing that the Normans bring in is they bring in new attitudes to human life. And this is one of the things that is always a hard sell with audiences, is that people think of the Normans as masters of war and savages. And they were savage in their warfare, no question. They were extremely good at war. And yet their attitudes to human life was slightly different to the sort of old school way that the Anglo-Saxons had done things. So in Anglo-Saxon England, slavery was still a big thing right down to the conquest. Maybe 20% of the population, and it would have been much, much higher centuries before, but 20% of the population at least were slaves. After the Norman Conquest, that's not the case. They're still poor and they're still made to work the land, but they are serfs rather than slaves. And there's a big difference there. Slaves you can kill if they displease you. It's a sin because God says thou shalt not kill, but it's not a crime to kill one of your slaves. So slaves have no rights at all under the law. Serfs do. Slaves can be sold. The families can be split up. So you can sell your female slaves and your male slaves. You can split up their families. You can't do that with serfs. So that's a big change after the conquest. So there's changes in attitudes towards human life. There's changes in architecture. There's changes in warfare. But here's the punchline. I don't think the conquest in the long term made that much difference. I think if you'd left it a couple of centuries, everywhere in Europe got castles in the end. So the English would have got castles. They would have built them themselves. It wouldn't have been as quick. It wouldn't have been as traumatic. They probably wouldn't have had so many. The thing about the conquest and any upheaval like the conquest that makes it remarkable is the rate of change. It's one of those dates when history speeds up and people feel it and they start writing about it and complaining about it. But if you had done it over 2 centuries, if the Romanesque architectural shift hadn't been done in a single generation, you'd have still ended up with Romanesque churches. It just would have taken a lot longer and been a lot less traumatic. So I think it wouldn't have been exactly the same, but you would have got all these things eventually. What you wouldn't have got is the language that we've been speaking in now. You wouldn't have got this crazy hybrid mashup of English with this this heavy overlay of French, a Romance language and a Germanic language, and the crazy grammatical mayhem that occurs as a result. So I think that is the single most enduring legacy of the conquest, is the language we speak today, English.
Well, there would be all sorts of English teachers out of work across the globe because they wouldn't be paid to get into the crazy nuance of the language. A sentence I gave my students was, English is difficult. It can be understood, though, through tough, thorough thought. Spelled almost exactly the same, but pronounced completely differently due to the reasons you just gave. Well, thank you for this overview. I mean, this is a very long stretch of history. Anything else that you would like to emphasize that you hope listeners take away from this to perhaps whet their appetite to go check out your book?
The thing that I was keen to stress in the book is that when we talk about the Anglo-Saxons, there's normally a tendency with this early period to see only the good stuff. So when you look at something like Sutton Hoo, and people, because they're enthusiastic and because it's a long time ago, they will say, look at the intricacy of the jewelry, look at the beautiful illustrated manuscripts, look at the Lindisfarne Gospels, look at how courageous they are. Isn't this poetry beautiful? Isn't it resonant? So there's a tendency to see it all as wonderful, and it is. It's great stuff. And yet at the same time, I think the crucial thing is we have to remember that the people in this period, although they may be our distant ancestors, they're not us. And they are not the Victorians either, although they sound like Victorians because they're all called Alfred and Harold and Edmund and Ethel. Their society was profoundly different. As I say, it was, in many respects, that society is a society we would have found contemptible. Or, if that's too harsh, we would have found it very troubling. A society that's built on the ownership of slaves. A society that practices war as slave hunt, a society that is extremely patriarchal and misogynistic to the extent that we don't know anything about the women for 3 centuries in the narrative sources for that precise same reason. It's a society that I've already said was extremely theocratic in the middle of the 10th century and other times besides, but particularly that point. So, and I think also extremely intolerant a lot of the time. So, I think it's important that we see these people in the round and don't put them on a pedestal. There's lots of things that we will find familiar and lots of things that we will find repulsive. So we have to understand them, but we don't have to idolize them.
Well, it's counterintuitives like that go against people's intuition that I think leads to the best learning opportunities. So I appreciate all that you shared. And for listeners who want to check out more, the name of your book is The Anglo-Saxons, A History of the Beginnings of England, 400 to 1066. Mark, thank you for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Scott.
All right, listeners. Well, that is all that I have for today's episode. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Bill Ivey, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tom from Ohio, Ryan Gillen, Rob from Chicago, Nick Brooks, Michael from New York, Carl from Norway, Josh Reddick, Jennifer French-Lee, Jay Carrington, McCrae's, Salvador Sanchez, David Santi, Chris C., and Baron Fraser. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also, I have exclusive content there, such as live streams where I do live versions of podcast episodes where you can leave feedback as I'm talking, and I will address it on air. Last, and I think this is the best, is to join our membership program, the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were George Washington's spies during the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program for History Unplugged. If you go to patreon.com/unplugged, you can join the membership program at 3 levels. If you join at the Scout level, you'll get all 400 episodes of History Unplugged absolutely ad-free and early access to new episodes. If you join at the 2nd level, the Intelligence Officer level, you get all the stuff that Scouts get, along with bonus episodes. There's currently about 40 of them, including series on Audie Murphy and Operation Long Jump about the Nazi attempt to assassinate FDR, Churchill, and and Stalin in 1943. Finally, if you join at the Spy Master level, you'll get a shout out to you and or your business at the end of each episode. You get a 3-pack of hardcover history books, and you can find out what those are if you go to patreon.com/unplugged. Finally, you can ask me a question about history on absolutely any topic on Earth, and I will research it and devote an entire episode to your question. Probably about 30% of the questions in the archive for the show have been based on these sorts of questions. So there you go. Go to patreon.com/unplugged to learn more.